All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to unpack a really fascinating way of looking at the Americas. And it's all based on the incredible work of the Brazilian intellectual Darcy Ribeiro. Okay, so let's start with a big question, a kind of puzzle. If you think about it, from Canada all the way down to Chile, the entire Americas were shaped by European expansion. But the societies that grew out of that are worlds apart. I mean, just look at the United States and Mexico. They share a border, but their national identities, their cultures, they couldn't be more different. So why? Well, the key to cracking this puzzle, or at least one powerful key, comes from Darcy Ribeiro. See, his big idea was this. To get why these places are so different, you can't just look at economics or politics. No, you have to look at how the people themselves were actually formed. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with Ribeiro's core theory, then we'll walk through his three big categories: the transplanted peoples, the witness peoples, and the new peoples, with a special focus on Brazil. And then we'll see what this all means when we look through this new lens. All right, so let's get into the heart of it. What is Ribeiro's big idea? Ribeiro called his framework historical cultural configurations. Now, that sounds academic, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's a way of sorting nations not by race or language or religion, but by the process, the actual how. Their populations were created during that whole colonial period. And his point was that this formation process left a permanent mark, a kind of cultural DNA on their national character. So he basically saw three main paths, or configurations, that played out in the Americas. Let's take them one by one. First up, the transplanted peoples, who Ribeiro saw as, well, basically replicas of Europe. So, what are we talking about here? These are the nations that were born when huge groups of Europeans just packed up and moved to the New World, and for the most part, they recreated the societies they left behind. It was less about creating something new and more about just transplanting the old world onto new soil. Now, what's really interesting here are the specific traits he pointed out. First, these societies were overwhelmingly European, racially and culturally. Pretty homogeneous. And a lot of these colonies weren't set up as big money-making schemes, at least not at first. They were more like an outlet for Europe's extra population. And because of that, you got a society that was, initially anyway, a bit more egalitarian, based on the idea of the small farmer. And they really held on tight to the values and the ambitions of their European homelands. So who are we talking about? Well, the most obvious examples are the United States and Canada. And later on, thanks to massive waves of immigration, Argentina and Uruguay also came to fit this mold. These are the countries that really see themselves as an extension of that European legacy. Okay, so now let's shift gears to the second category, which paints a completely different picture. We're talking about the witness peoples, the heirs of these incredible ancient civilizations. The story here is not one of transplantation. It's one of a violent collision. Think about this. These are nations built literally on top of the foundations of huge, pre-existing indigenous empires. Civilizations that were conquered, their people decimated, and their entire culture just profoundly traumatized by the colonial conquest. So the crucial thing to get here is the starting point. These societies didn't start from scratch. They grew right out of the ruins of the Aztec, Inca, and Maya empires. They went through an almost unbelievable population collapse from disease and just brutal forced labor. And what came out of that was this really rigid social structure, almost like a caste system, with a hybrid culture that's in this constant struggle to fuse its two very different heritages, the Spanish and the indigenous. And you can probably guess where these are. We're talking about the heartlands of those ancient empires: Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Guatemala, and Ecuador. For these nations, the past isn't just a history lesson, it's alive. It's right there in the present, shaping everything. And that brings us to Ribeiro's third, and maybe his most mind-bending category, the new peoples, or the Povos-Novos, with Brazil being the absolute prime example. This is a story of creation through fire. The new peoples, they weren't just transplanted from somewhere else, and they weren't built on the ruins of one single cohesive empire. No, these societies were forged in the crucible of the colonial slave economy. You had three totally separate worlds, European, African, and indigenous, smashed together, stripped of their original cultures, and then forced to mix and melt into something that had never existed before. Ribeiro had this incredibly powerful phrase for it. He called them a new species on the ethnic level. I mean, just think about that. This wasn't just a new mix of people, he saw it as a fundamentally new kind of human society.
So what does that mean in practice? Well, it means you have a people who aren't defined by any one single ancestry. Their identity was shaped on the plantations, in the mines, places where they were cut off from their original traditions. And Ribeiro's big argument is that this makes them uniquely unbound by the past. They're people whose identity is defined less by where they came from and more by what they are becoming. So the number one example is, of course, Brazil. But this model also really fits for places like Venezuela, Colombia, and even Chile. These are nations that are just fundamentally defined by centuries of this deep racial and cultural fusion. And this table just lays it all out so perfectly. It really sums up the key differences. Just look across the rows. You've got the transplanted peoples, mostly European, and they preserved their culture. Then you've got the witness peoples, a hybrid, trying to stitch together two opposing traditions that were born out of conquest. And finally, the new peoples, a true mestizo mix, European, African, and indigenous, who had to forge a brand new culture, basically from the ashes of their old ones.
So what's the big takeaway here? Ribeiro's theory, it's more than just a neat way to categorize countries. It's really a new lens, a new way of seeing the Americas. And he saw something really profound and hopeful in this, especially for Brazil. He had this vision of this mestizo nation becoming, and these are his words, a civilization destined for joy, tolerance, and solidarity. And why? Precisely because it was born from the messy, chaotic coming together of so many different worlds. And that leaves us with a really powerful final thought to chew on. If Ribeiro is right, if there really are peoples out there who were forged in a way that frees them from the baggage of a single ancient tradition, what does that mean for the future? What kind of world can a people, who are defined only by what they can become, build for all of us?